Hi everyone, I'm Matt Landis with NGDU, and we're thrilled to continue our Serious Games Tech Talk series with Soren Johnson. As a designer, his work has included some of the most complex and commercially successful titles out there: Civilization 4, Spore, other web-based strategy games, and others I'm sure he can name. His designer notes blog and Design of the Times column inspires and informs both novice and experienced designers, and he continues to push the envelope for complex games that engage players and give serious game advocates and educators like myself hope that we can use these games for learning and growth and change. And it's a pleasure to welcome Soren Johnson.
All right. Thank you. It's great to be here. So let's get started. A little bit of my background. I've got a master's in CS. I did a lot of my work previously in AI, which was kind of my first entrance into the video game field. Big projects I've worked on: Civ 3, Civ 4. Civ 4 was a project that kind of led from beginning to end, so I was very, very into the details of that project. I came on for the last year and a half of Spore, did some work with AI and helped design sort of the latter half of the game. The year after that, I worked on sort of a small prototype, strategystation.com, which is an attempt to build basically a moddable site for strategy games on the web. Is actually built entirely with GWT, which I found to be kind of a really nice toolkit. And I'm currently the lead designer of a web-based MMO done inside of EA 2D, which is a small group inside of the EA Games label. But today I'm mostly here to talk about AI. And here's a little outline of what I'm going to be going through. First of all, I'm going to define two types of AI that people typically aim to make. One I'll sort of just categorize as good, and another type I'll categorize as fun. And I'll go into the details of what the differences are. Then I'll talk about Civilization, because the AI for that game kind of fits somewhere, sometimes uncomfortably, between those two extremes. And I'll talk about some of the issues with that. Always a popular one. People discover that the AI cheats, and they're very upset, so I'll talk about all of those issues. And then talk a little about the development of the AI. And actually, the AI to Civ 4 was released publicly about maybe 6 months after the game shipped. So if anyone actually wants to look through that, I'll provide a link to that code. And hopefully we'll have time for some Q&A. So what do I mean when I say good AI versus fun AI? So good AI, the idea is you're trying to build an AI that's just literally trying to beat the player. That's its pure goal. It's meant to be a substitute for a person when you can't find someone else to play the game with you, or you don't want to wait for someone to do their turns, et cetera, et cetera. Fun AI is a game where you're using AI algorithms as the actual content in itself, and these are generally single player. It's all focused on the player's direct experience. It's not about trying to replace another human. So. Sort of the classic example of good AI, of course, is something like Deep Blue, which is now capable of playing at the very highest levels. And this is just you want to play chess and you want to play against a human. That problem is now solved. And people who are into this field sort of take perhaps a perverse pleasure in showing us that a lot of the games we enjoy are now over if you want to play against the AI. That no matter what, they can beat us. It was proved a few years ago that checkers is solved. No matter what you do, the AI can always find a way to beat you or draw. And as I mentioned before, sort of a human substitute. People want to play all sorts of different types of war games, strategy games, board games, and it's simply a convenience. It allows them to practice on their own, or maybe that's just the way they prefer to play. They don't like the intensity of playing against one of the humans or a friend. So with fun AI, the algorithms themselves are the content. Now the two examples I put up here are Black and White and The Sims. These are both examples of games which have a lot of AI in it, but that AI is all about behavior. And learning. In the case of the creature in Black and White, if you slap it around, it does one thing. If you pet it, it ends up developing a different way. And The Sims is sort of this little ant farm type game where you place down, you build your little house, place down your little furniture, and what makes the game interesting is seeing how the little AI entities move around the environment and either enjoy their lives or die because their bladder explodes. And here's an example that I'm going to draw on a lot in this talk. It's a game called Desktop Tower Defense, which is a really fun little flash tower defense game. I recommend everyone should play it because it's a really neat little game. But essentially in this game, you have, I'm sorry. You have what are known as creeps come from one side of the grid, and they're trying to get to the other side. And your job is you're trying to prevent that. And it's essentially a game about pathfinding. And what that means is you're going to place down these little towers, which are those little square things you see on the screen here. And the AI is going to route through them and try their best to get to the other side. And you want to make that as hard as possible for them. You want to inhibit their progress. So in many ways, this is a game about pathfinding, essentially. That's what makes the game interesting. If it didn't have a good pathfinding engine, it wouldn't be nearly as fun. And the other main point about fun AI is the focus is really on the player. And one of the best examples of this is the concept of aggro in MMOs, like World of Warcraft, which I'm showing here. And the idea here is, aggro is a great case of fun AI because it's not meant to be challenging, it's meant to be understandable, comprehensible. And for people not familiar with this basic concept, in MMOs, in sort of classic MMO combat, you have three different character types. You have your tanks, your healers, and your DPS. The tanks are there to absorb damage. They're the best defended. They have the best armor, for example. The healers are meant to heal the units as they get hit, and DPS characters are there to actually damage the enemies. And aggro is sort of an internal algorithm that determines who the AI is going to attack, who the monsters decide to target. And what aggro does is, as you attack the monsters, it starts deciding, okay, that guy's been doing a lot, that guy's been attacking a lot, so we're going to start targeting him, or that guy's been healing a lot, so we're going to target him. But the game gives you a number of ways to control aggro. There's various spells you can use to sort of trick the AI to attack the wrong characters. You can, there's big web pages and strategy guides devoted so you know how to control aggro, how to move your characters around so they don't suck up too much aggro. Because essentially, what you want is your tank to get all of the aggro of the monsters. And because the tank isn't the one that's necessarily doing all the attacking, that can be tricky. And you'll see that this is really essentially a puzzle. It's not really AI. This is what I'm showing right here is actually a World of Warcraft mod, something that people can put inside of the game where they can get quick information about who the AI is aggroing, who they want to attack, and how that works. And this is a sign that Blizzard actually wants players to be able to control aggro. It's an active gameplay element. It's not something that the AI is trying to defeat you, right? Because it would be very easy for their AI programmers to essentially say, aggro is really kind of a dumb idea. We shouldn't let the players be able to influence it. We shouldn't let the players be able to find out who is aggroing who. We should instead always focus on which character is doing the most damage. But that's not actually fun. It's more fun if aggro becomes this little gameplay element that you can manipulate. The game is about the player after all. So essentially, you have this spectrum, which goes from good AI on one side, which is chess is sort of the classic example, and fun AI on the other side with desktop tower defense. And I'm going to talk about a few other games and where they kind of fit in. StarCraft sort of fits on the left side of the spectrum here, especially because it's a sort of symmetrical game. When you're playing against one or two or three AI opponents, they're really playing the same game as you are, essentially. I don't mean the balance between Zerg, Protoss, and Terrans, but I mean that they have the same goals, they're playing on the same map. They could be a human, they could be an AI, it's not really going to matter. And also, there's no real diplomacy in StarCraft, which is important, something I'll talk about a lot later. A game like Heroes of Might and Magic is more on the fun side of the spectrum. This is a game where you're taking your hero character around the map, you're bringing an army with you, and you're fighting a series of battles. But the game is essentially giving you a series of challenges to overcome. It's not seriously trying to defeat you in the same way. It's more of an example of an asymmetrical game. Now, Civilization kind of fits somewhere in the middle, and the main reason it's not on the far left like StarCraft is because of the diplomacy issue, which I'll talk about later. But let's talk about a few other things that define the difference between good AI and fun AI. One is how the rules change over time. On the far extreme left, a game like chess, the rules are very fixed. They're not going to change, so that the AI becomes sort of a known problem. Go is a good example of this because Go AI is actually much, much, much worse than chess AI. So this is a sort of a standard problem that the AI field is focused on. Whereas on the other side of the scale, a game like Desktop Tower Defense actually changes monthly. They're constantly twiddling with the rules, adding new towers, changing the way the mobs work. The point is not that there's some fixed game that they're trying to improve the AI against. It's something that's sort of constantly changing. Symmetry is another big issue. When you're talking about good AI, generally speaking, the game is going to be very symmetrical. All of the opponents are playing the exact same type of game. On the far right side, it tends to be very asymmetrical, where it's sort of like player versus environment, essentially. You have this challenge, and you're facing entities that maybe have AI, but they're playing a completely different game from what you're playing. Usually, the only question is whether you can overcome that specific challenge. Generally speaking, when you're talking about these type of games, good AI tends to be multiplayer focused, and fun AI tends to be single player. Symmetrical games tend to be mapped to multiplayer very well because the idea is, you just have two humans sitting down, facing off against each other, and the AI really is just a pure replacement. Another issue is what type of tactics are available. When you're writing good AI, everything is on the table. You're free to choose from any tactic that a human might choose from. When you're writing fun AI, you very much actually want to limit the tactics that your AI is going to pursue. Similar to my example earlier about Aggro and WoW, in that the AI designers purposely chose to take some things off the table to let their AI be manipulated with Aggro. In Desktop Tower Defense, for example, also, you don't really want the mobs to develop intelligence so that they're like, okay, let's actually gather our strength and let's wait, let's form up a big force for a while, and then we'll go through the maze. That's something a human might do if they were in control of the mobs, but we don't want the AI to do that because that's not the point of the game. The point of the game is that the player can anticipate the way the mobs work and anticipate the rhythm of the game. When you're measuring the performance of your AI, there's also a difference. Usually when you're talking about good AI, you have a very objective measure. We kind of have this concept of how chess AI has been improving over the years, every few years at a time, and it's easy to measure that. But when you're on the right side of the scale, it's completely subjective, right? It's just one of these things that depends upon sort of a gut feeling about are your players having fun or not. It's almost more of a puzzle type thing. And when it comes to the Turing test, when you're on the far left side of the scale, your goal really is to pass the Turing test. And certainly with games like chess and checkers, they probably have done that unless they're actually perhaps too good at this point. That may be a question, but they can easily pass that if we want to. On the right side of the scale, though, it's really irrelevant. No one thinks that the mobs in Desktop Tower Defense are controlled by a human. It's obvious that they are not, but that's not really the point. So here's a sort of a quick summary of the differences between the two. And this is one way you might want to sum that up. Good AI is playing to win. Fun AI is essentially playing to lose. You're providing an interesting challenge for the human, but your ultimate goal is you want the human to have fun. You want them to win at the end. Okay, so what about the Civ AI? Where does that fit in? Before I dive into that, I'll give sort of a quick history of civilization. Now, I assume a lot of you have played it here, so I'm probably not going to go into too much detail, but it's sort of a classic turn-based game about the history of the world. Sid Meier first developed it back in 1991. It's had 4 versions so far, although a 5th one is coming out in a month, I guess. There's usually been a version every 4 or 5 years. Civ 2 added more units, had a different view, created a scenario editor. Civ 3 came along in 2001. That was the first one I was involved in. It added culture, which controlled your borders and resources, which limited what you could build, which were kind of the big sort of gameplay improvements there. Civ 4 was in 2005, added religion and great people. Those are the big changes. But we also went through and kind of tried to simplify all of the design cruft that had been developing over the first 3 versions of the game to kind of pare back to the parts of the game that we really cared about. It was also the first game where we really focused on multiplayer from the very beginning. It wasn't something that was just going to be sort of patched on as an afterthought. So, where does the Civ AI fit? Like I said, it's somewhere in the middle. So that can lead to some issues because it's not necessarily always clear what solution we should use for the various problems you face as an AI developer. So, for example, when it comes to whether it's fixed rules or evolving design, Civ is kind of both. There's some core things about the Civ franchise that haven't changed in, well, I guess in the 20 years it's been around, but obviously with each version things change. So it's not like we can still use the AI that Sid wrote back in 1991. It's had to be rewritten every time and with every expansion pack and even to some times with every patch. It is a symmetrical game. You expect that your AI opponents are playing the same game as you are. They're simply China while you're India or Germany. They're just a different Civ. Civ is generally known as a great single-player game. There is a multiplayer community, but that's really where probably 95% of our players spend their time, is in the single player. It is a game with limited options. And some people might actually not assume that, right off the bat, but there's actually a lot of things we don't let the AI do because we feel like it would be annoying. They would be types of play that we only really expect the human should do. And a lot of these issues come down to diplomacy. There are some subjective factors here, but there definitely are some objective tests we can use to make sure our Civ AI is still going well. We had some automated testing with Civ 4 where every night I could see whether the AI was improving or getting worse. And so there's some ways to do it objectively. And this is probably maybe the most different one. People would like it to pass the Turing test, but it never will. It completely fails on the Turing test. That's because we really want, it's kind of a funny thing about humans themselves. When we write the AI for Civ, we actually want them to role play. We want Isabella to play a certain way. We want Montezuma to play a certain way. We want Gandhi to be, nicer than the other leaders, perhaps. But even though he's not always. But when you play humans, you don't actually really expect them to role play. I mean, they're going to do whatever they can to win, including some very nasty things. And that may be, like I said, that may be okay for Montezuma, but it's not okay for everyone else. So the trick here is trying to, strike a balance. What should we do with the Civ AI when it comes in these really fuzzy areas where it's not clear whether it should be good AI or fun AI? And making this problem worse is that every player is different. I'd say there's really kind of 3 types of players for Civ. There's the challenge players, and these are the people who really trying to work their way up the difficulty scale. They want to eventually beat the game of deity. That's what defines Civ for them. There's the sandbox players who don't really care. They probably come to Civ from other games like SimCity or something like that, and they're just kind of enjoying the experience of going through history and playing with the different world wonders and with the different leaders, and just seeing how things go. Then there's probably also the narrative players who really get into the concept of role playing, where they really want to play a leader a certain way, and they really want the AI to have their own personalities and their own styles. So for these players, it's really important for us that the AI maintains a memory of the things you've done. That if you stab them in the back earlier in the game, they're not going to trust you later in the game. And furthermore, it's okay to even let the AI fall for traps. That if the player has gone to a lot of effort to trick them into thinking that something is one way when it's really not, we want the AI to make a mistake. That gives the player a lot of satisfaction. At the end of the day, though, we want the players to win or to at least understand why they lost. That's really the number one thing. And so on top of that, we need difficulty levels for a number of reasons. First of all, it lets the sandbox players off easy. If you play a game on Settler on Civ 4, it's very, very hard to lose. In fact, the AI will never declare war on you, period. If you really try, you can lose, of course. But generally speaking, if you just kind of flow through the game, you're going to do fine. But on the other end of the scale, difficulty levels give challenge players something to aim for, a goal, working their way up the scale. And different tactics are available at different levels, which makes the game, there's certain things you could just never do at deity, if you want to compete, and vice versa on Settler. So it kind of, just sort of changes the nature of the game. So that leads to the question of sort of AI cheating, because the AI in Civ is so complex that there's no way we can just change the difficulty levels by making the AI dumber. Instead, it usually comes down to giving them bonuses on the lower levels and giving them penalties on the higher levels. And AI cheating is a very, very, very subjective issue. And in fact, humans are notoriously poor at judging cheats. I've had years of experience of looking through the forums, seeing how people respond to the games, and it's always very interesting to read so many times they perceive the AI cheating when it's not cheating, and when it is cheating, they don't notice it. It's very, very strange. I don't know how many people have maybe played a game called Puzzle Quest, but it has kind of a very interesting issue with cheating. This is sort of a variation of Bejeweled, which is a match 3 game. You're trying to arrange 3 colored items in a row, and then they disappear, and things fall from the top of the screen. And if you get lucky when they fall, it can lead to chains, and you get a series of matches, which gives you an extra bonus. So the issue there is when it's the AI's turn, if they get that kind of lucky drop from the top, people perceive that the AI got lucky. When the human gets a lucky drop, they always perceive that, well, that's because I was smart and I, arranged it away, so I was, my luck would be, it was more likely that I was going to succeed. But when the AI gets it, it's a dirty, filthy, sneaking cheater. Whoa. All right, are we still on? Is that just one projector? Okay. Yeah, he's getting back. But yeah, but the AI developer of Puzzle Quest has sworn over and over and over again that the AI does not cheat. It's just purely random. I can't know for sure, but I've had similar experiences, so I believe him. And in fact, if I was talking to him, I would recommend actually anti-cheating, where they make sure that the AI does not get lucky drops, because it's more important that the human feel comfortable that the AI isn't doing something nasty behind the scenes, than to actually have a fair playing field, even if it means handicapping the AI. That's totally fine. So there's a lot of sort of philosophical questions with cheating, but let's get into the details here. So obviously, on the far left of the scale, no one wants your chess AI to cheat. That's not going to work. They shouldn't be stealing pieces while you're not looking. And on the far right of the scale, you don't really play. If the AI started warping units around the grid of desktop tower defense, you just quit. You would assume actually it would be a bug, not really cheating. Now, For Civ, as I said, yes, we definitely cheat, but how should we cheat? So first of all, here are the production modifiers. When you play a game of Civ, on the noble level, it's essentially even, where all the techs and buildings and units, they all cost the same for the AI as they do for you. On settler, everything costs the AI 50% more, so it takes them it's slower. On deity, everything costs them 40% less. And this has a huge impact over the game because, of course, Civ's one of those games where it's kind of slowly snowballs. Where if you're able to get your grain out faster, that lets you grow citizens quicker, which lets you work more plots, which lets you build the next building faster, and it sort of grows exponentially. And here is the same idea in graph form. See, it's a pretty big difference. But actually, even is not really even, and this is something that's bothered a certain subset of our players a lot. We said, okay, noble is essentially the even level, but it's not really. There's a number of other cheats that the AI gets. It gets bonuses when it's attacking barbarians. It doesn't have to pay the same amount for unit support or unit upgrades. It doesn't have the same issues with inflation. And there's a reason for that. The AI simply needs more help in this area. When a human plays the game, they don't think of it this way, but they have a lot more options available than the AI does. They can reload, right? They can open up the world builder and just get themselves some free units. They can, even something more basic, like when you play in a game of Civ, oftentimes people will just leave all of their cities empty in their interior of units because they know that these cities are safe, they're far from their borders, and of course they always have the option of reloading if something crazy happens. There's no way I can have the AI follow a similar tactic, right? If I said, okay, let's have the AI leave half of their cities empty, they'd be wiped off the map very quickly. So it's just not an option to do those type of things. So the question of is there an actual level of difficult level of Civ 4 where everything is completely even, the AI is playing the exact same game, that's really essentially an academic question. And it's one that I'm not really concerned about. I'm only really concerned about the player experience. And in that sense, cheating should not be linear. There's some things that the AI is going to need help with at every level, regardless. So I think this is important. However, it's very important that the game never feels unfair. In Civ 1, there was essentially free wonders. And what that means is not just production bonuses, but every once in a while, if one of the AI was falling behind, Sid wrote in that it would just give you the pyramids for free, give the AI the pyramids for free, or here have the Great Wall, so on and so forth. And this is something that just felt very wrong to players, especially, of course, if they were aiming for the same wonder. And it's funny the difference between where we give the AI just kind of a little bonus every turn. They maybe can still build the wonder before you do, but somehow it feels more fair because you see the AI is actually building the wonder instead of just being granted in it. Even worse, though, was the idea of ganging up on the human, which is that in Civ 1, there's literally a piece of the code that says if the year is 1900 and the human is in the lead, then declare war on the human. And people suspected it, and it's true. But they also hated it. That was probably a mistake. With Civ 3 and Civ 4, we moved to human-blind diplomacy, which means all of the diplomacy calculations the AI uses to determine who to attack, when they're willing to make peace, who they're willing to trade with. At no point does it ask whether the person it's talking to is a human or not. However, there are definitely lots of information cheats in Civ 3 and Civ 4. And this is kind of a learning process because if the human can see behind the curtain, it can still feel unfair. So it's something we have to work on. And my favorite example of this is the amphibious assault problem, which is sort of an interesting exploit that players found after Civ 3 came out. Basically, doing an amphibious assault is a very tricky proposition for an AI programmer. And so one of the things we did is, okay, we have 4 transports loaded up with goods. Let's look at the AI. Let's look at our enemy cities and try to figure out which one has the least number of troops in it, and we'll go and we'll try to invade right next to it. Players figured this out, and they figured out this way to essentially, sort of trick the AI, where they said, okay, we're going to put one unit, we're going to leave this city empty, because we know the AI is coming with an invasion force. So I see the AI is going to start routing all of its ships towards that city. But when it gets just a turn or two away, I'm going to move a unit into that city and take a unit out of a city that's way on the other side of the coast. And I think you're already anticipating what happens, because yeah, essentially you see the entire fleet turn around, start going around the other side, and of course when they get there, you just switch them around again, and then it turns around. You got the AI stuck in an infinite loop, looking like a moron. So that's not good at all. Although I do kind of admire their ingenuity. We start randomly updating the assault target. Said, okay, we only change our target every 8 turns, every 12 turns. It kind of changes randomly. We also ignore temporary data like units. So the human could never just kind of change things from turn to turn to mess around with those calculations. Because really, I actually didn't. This is the type of thing that I don't trust myself to do it right, so that there's no way a human can figure out a way to exploit it. So let's talk about diplomacy right now, because this is kind of the big issue for the Civ AI. When is it okay for the AI to ally with each other? Does that feel fair to the human? Because if you're facing a big AI alliance, are they allying against you just because you're the human, or is it because that actually what makes sense in the game? Is it okay? Should the human be trusted ever? Let's talk about the fake peace problem, right? Everyone I'm sure has probably done this at some point, but when you're playing a game of Civ, you're beating down some poor opponent, and he comes begging to you for peace and says, "Here, I'll give you 200 gold if you just end war with me." And you're like, "Okay, sure, I'll take the 200 gold," and next turn, declare war, right? Because humans, of course, can't be tricked. Should the AI do something like that? Right? This is an example of something where we take an option off the table. In Civ 4, we kind of solved this at the very top level, where we just said, okay, if you make peace, you literally cannot declare war for 10 turns. But it's a good example of something where the AI cannot really play the game the same way that the human can. We want the AI to be role playing, where the actions they make seem like what a AI character, what a historical character would do, not a human that's trying to game the system. That's not what we're aiming for. And then there's the tech trading problem, which really shows out that cheating is relative. Like, here are these 3 true sentences that I'll read here. We know that when you're playing a game, the AI should be trading text with each other. Everyone will agree with that. The AI should be trading text fairly with each other. They shouldn't be just swapping text between each other because, like, oh, hey, you're an AI too. Okay, well, we'll give you a better deal. And then it's also true that the human has the agency to sell technologies cheaper than they would normally, just if they feel like it's to their advantage. The human can even give away text if they'd like. There's a problem here. These 3 sentences cannot all be true at the same time. There's sort of an issue, which is, should the AI be able to sell text cheaply? If you're saying that the AI should be able to pursue all the tactics that a human would, then the answer would be yes. But unfortunately, that leads to lots and lots of problems. Namely that the main problem is it felt like, in Civ 3, I went out and said, okay, I'm going to have the AI try to trade text the way humans would. So, for example, if you're playing, you're the human, you're playing the game. Germany is your neighbor. They're very weak. They only have a couple cities, and they come to you asking for ironworking, right? And you've got ironworking. That's a very powerful tech. You don't normally want to trade it away, but okay, Germany's weak. Germany will never be a threat. Doesn't really matter to me if I give away ironworking. However, Germany only has 20 gold to give me, right? Clearly, ironworking is worth a lot more than that, but I could never get more than 20 gold from Germany anyway. So my choice is either 20 gold or nothing. So in that situation, I might decide, okay, I am going to trade ironworking for much less than it would be worth normally to Germany just because I want the money. I'm going to be better off than I was after making that trade. Fine, you could say that's good strategy. The problem is that if the AI pursues that same route, it may be doing everything fairly, underneath the hood, but from the player's point of view, all they're going to see is all of the AI essentially, moving through the tech tree at the same rate. and also at a very fast rate. And there'll be these AI civs out there that are very weak, but have actually quite a lot of technologies, because all the AIs are essentially arbitraging with each other, trying to get these small gains by training all their techs. In fact, this was referred to by the name of tech whoring inside of our fan community. So I tried to solve this problem with the Civ 4 AI, and I think it seems like it basically solved it. It wasn't as big of an issue with that game, which is basically that I said, okay, I'll let the AI undersell its technologies for a third, but if at all possible, you try to make up the difference in gold. It only trades on certain random turn intervals, so it's not just constantly happening every turn. And most importantly, there's kind of a high level refuses to trade with logic that's going on, where even if we can make a deal, there's some reason why I don't like you. You have a different religion. We have close borders. We've had conflict in the past. The AIs use that same logic between each other as they do with a human. And that seemed to give the system enough friction that it prevented that problem, where the AI can still undersell text, but not to such an extremity. And here it's really important to go back to the question of what's the whole point of cheating? Are you trying to write the best AI possible? Are you trying to beat the human? Are you trying to be fair? Cheating is simply for challenge, which is one source of fun, right? When the AI is cheating, you're trying to provide an interesting game for the players who are looking for a challenge, but you're trying to do it in a way where it's still going to be a fun, engaging experience, and something that's not annoying or make the player suspicious of the AI or think the whole system is jerry-rigged against them. Which leads to this other issue of, to what extent do we design for the AI? Because Civ is a symmetrical game, every option that we include in the game has to be handled by the AI as well as for the human, which means there's going to be some options that might be a good design idea, but if the AI just completely can't handle it, we may have to take it out. There can be some exceptions to that rule. But only if they come in very specific, very small places. Things like nukes. Nukes are very powerful, but generally we basically just disable them entirely for the AI, so they don't have to worry about handling them, and players don't have to worry about handling them on the business end, I guess. But there are a number of design changes we made over the years with the series, especially in Civ 3 and Civ 4. Where we changed the game design in a way that really helped the AI manage its empire. Things like moving from localized unit support, where every city supported a specific number of units, to global, where it's just all comes out of your national treasury. The idea of closed borders, where you can't just wander freely through someone else's territory. Enforced peace treaty, which I mentioned earlier, which is the idea that when you make peace with someone, you literally cannot declare war again for another 10 turns. This ICS is a term called, means infinite city sleaze, which is kind of a degenerate strategy where players essentially found a city on every other tile on the map. And that's something we would never want the AI to do, and we don't really want the human to do it either. But most importantly, we don't want to have to build the AI in a way they're supposed to compete with that. However, every one of these times when we make a design change in a way to help out the AI, we're also making sure we're not just designing simply for the AI. Each one of these examples is a change that the human would enjoy as well. Players really like the fact that their borders actually meant something now, and they hated AI. In Civ 3, they hated AIs just sort of randomly wandering through their territory. So it was a change that was really embraced by the fan community for Civ 4. Same with enforced peace treaties, because now diplomacy in multiplayer games can be actually interesting. If you come to me in a multiplayer game of Civ 3 and you say, hey, let's make peace, I'd be like, well, it makes no difference whether we're at war or peace. I still can't trust you. But in Civ 4, if I say, okay, here's peace, that means we literally can't attack each other for 10 turns. That actually has some meaning now. So I want to take a little bit of time here to kind of talk about some more details about the Civ AI. So one of the things that's kind of unique about Civilization is that the AI has always been written by the game's lead designer, which I think is it shows that the AI is not really an afterthought. It's really very much thought as a core piece of the design. The way the AI behaves is just as important as how the gameplay mechanics work. It's not actually a very large chunk of the code, as an example, this is the overall Civ 4 code base. The AI is maybe just 2 to 3% of it. And the big issue with AI, to me, usually is a question of how do you test it. It can be fairly easy to write some AI, and it looks like it works, but you don't really know until you're able to stress test it essentially. You can't really do traditional testing where you just, which in video game development means you take 4, 6, 8 testers, you give them some checklist, and they play through the game and make sure the AI does this and that. The problem is there's just so many variations to a game like Civ, and so many things that we're not even going to be able to anticipate ourselves as designers that's not going to work. So we used essentially a two-prong approach where we had some automated testing. Where every night we would see how the AI has changed from the previous day's build. But then we also gathered about 100 of our hardcore fans to play the game for a year and a half before we released. And that made a huge difference because they found all the things before we shipped. They usually get found after we shipped. So we were able to fix those things early. Another thing that's important about the Civ AI is it's what I could have termed soft-coded, which that means there's no AI scripts, there's no specific build orders. In fact, there's no enums in the code at all. Like for example, you might imagine that in the code for a game like Civ, there's a list of building enums, where it's 0 equals temple and 1 equals barracks and 2 equals granary. It actually was essentially the way it worked in Civ 1, but it's something we've moved away from over the years, where everything is essentially data-driven. All of those concepts exist in XML files that can be changed purely as data, we can't even, the AI has to anticipate the fact that this concept of a temple might disappear. We might someday decide just to take it out or add different types. This leads to less brittle code. Obviously, if you have some sort of hard-coded build order, if the game balance changes, that really changes. That suddenly now, this whole strategy doesn't work. It also leads to less predictable AI, which is can be kind of a mixed blessing. Let me give an example here of what this means. If you had an enum for a temple, inside of the function where you decide what building to choose, you'd have something simply like this. If this is the building, give it a weight of 20. And that's not the right way to do it. Instead, what you want to do is break down the temple. Look at the temple at a high abstract level. What does it actually represent? Well, a temple gives you happiness and it gives you culture. So instead, let's assign values to how much happiness it gives and how much culture. And beyond that, maybe the city isn't unhappy to begin with. In which case, now the happiness that the temple brings my city is irrelevant. So now suddenly we have a much more nuanced view of how to give value to a temple, something that could handle any type of building we create that has these type of values. Further, generally speaking, when the AI is making a decision, it uses what I would call probabilistic reasoning, which is we look at a number of factors, we assign weights to them, we adjust those values according to the situation, we add some random noise, and then we finally come out with a decision. And here is an example of the tech value function, which is how it decides which technology to research first. Obviously, this is a much bigger function in the real game, but here's kind of a smaller one. So first off, it says, does this tech provide irrigation? In that case, give it a certain value. Does it give open borders? Okay, well, if it does, have I met anyone? Because if I haven't met anyone, that's irrelevant. If I have, okay, give some more value. Do I actually have coastal cities? Because if I don't have coastal cities, it's unlikely excuse me, that I'm going to be able to do any trading with them yet. Okay, I do. All right, we'll give a higher value, and then finally add in some random noise at the end. So in a nutshell, this kind of describes how we make the decisions. The nice thing about having soft-coded AI is it enables essentially very data-driven mods. Double Your Pleasure was a very popular mod for Civ 3, where essentially they doubled the game. They added 100 buildings, added 100 technologies, added a couple hundred units, all doing things that we didn't necessarily anticipate originally. And the AI can essentially handle it because it looks at buildings abstractly, not in terms of this is a temple, this is a barracks, this is a bank. So they can create new buildings that do things very differently, and the AI can still function. Fall from Heaven is a very popular mod from Civ 4. That's essentially the fantasy version of Civ. And they even added a magic system into the game to change the way you can promote your units to give them spells, for example. And similarly, it had building types and technology types we never anticipated, and the AI was still able to handle it. I mean, obviously, not necessarily as well as it could the core game because that's how the AI is balanced for, but still handle it pretty well. So we released the AI code for Civ 4 about 6 or 7 months after we shipped. It essentially allows you to compile a custom DLL, which replaces not just the AI, but actually all of the core game code, the code that determines how texts are researched, how buildings are built, how diplomacy works, so on and so forth. It was 100% independent of the engine, so it doesn't know anything about the graphics or the sound. I don't think it even necessarily needs to be know much about the operating system even. It just simply extends and you can use it to extend the game functionality. Like, for example, in Fall from Heaven, they added a magic system, which was only possible because we allowed them to build their own game DLL. Here's a link to the Civ 4 code. It's easy to find. Just type in Civ 4 code or AI SDK, and I'm sure you can find it. And that's it. And it looks like we have a few minutes for questions, so I'd be happy to answer anything.
I had a question about risk-taking as opposed to randomness, which is what I really like when I would play these games with a human, and then afterwards you would be like, why the hell did you do that crazy move? And he would be like, I was just going for it, man. Does the AI ever do that? And when it does these weird things, does it ever sort of log it so you could sort of see afterwards, like, oh, that was a weird thing it was trying. It wasn't cheating.
It wasn't cheating. There's so much kind of noise and unpredictableness that's kind of inherent in the system because the AI is such a giant beast that I would say that sometimes it happens. Mostly that was handled at the high level with the diplomacy, right? Because that really changed what the AI was deciding to do. And so that was kind of a constant question of how random do we want the diplomacy to be? Because usually what you're talking about when you're taking a big risk, that usually involves declaring war on someone or deciding that, like, I'm not going to help this guy out anymore. And I think we kind of solved that problem with AI personalities, where some of the AIs are a lot more predictable than others. When I mean AIs, I mean Montezuma, Bismarck, Gandhi, Washington. So if you look in, there's actually an XML file that defines the personalities for those different leaders, and you'll see, I forget what they're called now, but you'll see some columns that are literally like randomness or predictableness, or which is, I think, fairly close to what you're talking about, which is, this is the chance that this Civ will attack a larger opponent, or try to build up an alliance, an unlikely alliance against this guy, or be really obstinate in refusing to make peace even when they should. So yeah, we had some stuff like that. I mean, I think there's more we could do. Like, I'd like it to do some kind of crazier things. But
yeah, I'd like that breakdown at the end. Like, if it was random on whether it should make peace, so that at the end you could see, oh wow, it like rolled really low number, so that's why the hell it wasn't dealing.
Yeah, that's the nice thing about playing a game like a D&D game where it actually shows you, like, oh, actually, this crazy thing happened because this thing actually rolled, as opposed to something else. Anything else?
How much does the AI cheat as far as like intelligence gathering? So I know I forget if it was Civ 3 or Civ 4 that added espionage, but generally it seems like the AI opponents have more knowledge about how many troops you have than they would have been able to surmise if you had closed borders.
Yeah.
So do they do cheating around that so they actually know whether you're a weaker opponent or if you're just faking?
Yeah, that's always a tricky one to answer. They definitely do. Like, they have complete knowledge, but the AI is not some sort of independent entity that's kind of looking into things. Like, I only let them look at things at appropriate times, if that makes sense. I'm trying to think of the best way to describe this. For example, I'm not keeping track of when units move in and out of the fog of war, because it leads to a really tricky AI problem of, can you move this direction? The human sees like, okay, the AI had a bunch of units here, and now they just moved in the fog of war, and now they're invisible. Well, I know they're there, right? I can't see them, but I know they're there. Trying to get the AI to be able to have a similar type of memory, where they're like, okay, there was a unit here a couple turns ago, it's probably still in this location, but I'm not sure, and that's to fade away over time. That's doable, but everything when you're developing a game like this is resource constrained. It's not an academic project, right? So we have to say, okay, is it worth trying to develop this very complex memory system, or should we just simply try to handle this subjectively, where we let the AI see whatever we want to let it, but not go overboard. And that's essentially the line we have to walk. So they know everything. We don't limit them from knowing anything, but we're making specific decisions about when they kind of like get to peak, if that makes sense.
Cool.
In his talk, some real quick kind of like series of questions. One, what the delay for the release of the AI code? I'm just kind of curious, and also, did you see were there any interesting contributions from the community that significantly changed the AI?
Right.
So the mods you talked about were more gameplay mods, and then maybe a little bit about debugging if you want to work that in, or maybe after this line.
Okay. Yeah, I'd be happy to talk afterwards. Sure. Yeah, so there was a delay with the AI code. That was partially just because it was kind of a hard project to push through legally inside of 2K. It was actually kind of it was something I just kept pushing for over and over and over again and talking about until it kind of finally just happened, and it wasn't necessarily an easy project to get them to buy in on because they'd never done anything like that before. But there was also the issue of games like this are big, and they almost inevitably get a number of patches the first 3 or 4 months after that. So we figured it'd be best to release the AI code when we knew that the code base was not going to change. And so that's one of the reasons we did that. And there were tons of very, very interesting things that came through. Obviously, there were sort of interesting gameplay mods, things like Fall from Heaven. There's a very interesting Dune mod. There's an interesting mod where they kind of tried to recreate Alpha Centauri. But there are also some improved AI mods where they're simply focusing on making a better AI. There's one guy named Blake, who's from New Zealand, I think, who made a really fantastic one. And he eventually got hired as a contractor to work on the expansion packs. And the work he did, I think, was literally just rolled into the expansion packs. So he wrote a better AI for us, and we used it and paid him for it.
Hi, so the amphibious assault thing made me think of this, which is that what a human being would do in that situation is they would go, oh, he's using this strategy on me, and I'm not going to win unless I change my behavior.
Right.
And the human being would represent and then analyze the other human's strategy. And notice that these programs don't actually tend to do that. It would be sort of an extremely soft-coded approach, which is like figure out what your opponent's goal is.
Right.
And I've noticed you guys don't do this in any kind of AI situation. Is that because it's too hard, or because it would be too weird and too difficult?
I'd say it's too hard, and it's beyond our resources, because what you're talking about is you need some kind of higher level AI that's above the AI that's watching the AI.
Right.
And like, oh, you're not making good decisions. You need to change this. And that means there's a number of problems there, challenges. One is you just simply, that assumes you understand your AI code better than you probably do. And in fact, there's been times we've experimented with that, and then what usually happens is like, oh wow, I didn't realize that that's actually the way the AI is making the decision. So it's really hard. It'd be nice, but like I said.
Sorry, follow up. Is it a matter of processing resources or a matter of...
it's a matter of developer resources.
Okay.
I don't think the processor is the issue. It's simply a question of how well you can understand your own code, which is constantly getting bigger and bigger and bigger and more complex.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, so I was wondering how often when you were developing the AI, you'd have like some idea for something that seemed like it would be really cool, and then you go and implemented it, and it totally sucked. or vice versa, where someone's like, oh, that's a terrible idea, and you put it in and it just works amazingly well. And also just looking back, is there something that you would have wanted to add to the AI that maybe they're adding for Civ 5? And also, I guess if anyone's on VC, you can pipe in with questions as well.
Right. Yeah, I mean, we make mistakes all the time, all the time. That's very much what game development's all about. Although most of the mistakes I usually think of are generally game mechanics mistakes, things the way we were changing the design of Civ 3 and Civ 4. With AI is usually catching up to the game design. You know, the game design plows ahead, and the humans, you know, when we're testing the game, the humans are the only ones who are able to really mess around with it, and then sort of the AI comes up behind. When I think of mistakes, it's usually stuff that comes afterwards, like revealed afterwards that makes me look dumb, I guess. You know, things like the amphibious assault problem. If there's something I really wish I could have fleshed out better, it would definitely be personalities. Like, I think there's a lot of space to grow for that, where you know, there are personalities in Civ 4, but I feel like they could be a lot deeper, a lot richer, remember a lot more things. You know, when you talk to them, players get a lot of feedback if you say, "Oh, I remember when you attacked me here," you know, stuff like that. You know, that I would like to experiment more with that.
To what extent do AIs have an advantage or a disadvantage because of their ability to micromanage units? Do they use the same day-to-day unit management that's kind of a default automatic one that the humans get, or do they do something different?
Yeah, Civ has a couple examples of places where it's making decisions automatically for you, especially if you turn on worker automation or decides to place its citizens, and it is essentially using the same code as the AI uses. The AI has some micromanagement advantages, but I'd say those really come to play more in real-time strategy games, because time is a resource. You know, the human can't be everywhere on the map, moving everyone around at the same time. In a turn-based game, I mean, that's what happens at the highest. Players who can beat the game at Deity and Emperor and so on, they're the ones who can spend 20 minutes doing a single turn, going through every one of the cities, making sure everything goes in the right box, exactly right. Although that was actually one of our high-level design goals, Civ 4 was trying to remove that stuff. Like, for example, in previous Civs, if you had if you were building a granary and you had more hammers or shields than you needed, they would kind of go to waste. So it would be to the players' advantage to go back to their cities and rebalance that. And Civ 4, we had those extra shields spill over to the next project, which means you no longer had to do that type of micromanagement. And that kind of helps the AI and the human, and as a high level, that's what we're trying to get to, where, you know, there isn't really a micromanagement advantage for either the AI or the human. Okay.
I guess my only question is what makes, in I think most of the Civ games, the AI for naval combat, air combat seem just totally different and much harder for the computer to figure out.
Yeah, naval combat is especially hard, and this is a problem in a lot of computer games. I would say the problem is just that it's so orthogonal to the rest of the game. You know, sort of your classic land combat kind of fits in with a lot of the other algorithms about determining, okay, these tiles have certain values. There's a resource here. We want to protect it. You know, this city is important. You know, I'm going to spend a lot of time thinking about pathfinding over the land. The water, everything is just so much different, and especially when you're talking about amphibious assaults, because it's not just moving some ships. You have to build transports. You have to build appropriate number of land units. You have to move those land units to the right coastal cities. You got to move the transports to them. You have to make sure you have enough escort units. You got to make sure those escort units are in the same cities as the transports. You got to make sure all those transports are ready at the same time, and you have to make sure that they're going to path to their target, so one of them is not going to get there 2 turns early. Compare that to like a land war, where you're literally just like, okay, get all my offensive units ready, move them towards the front, and go. You know, there's really an order of magnitude difference between those problems, and you can see that in a lot of other games too. There's a lot of RTSs have a problem where the AI is just really terrible at amphibious assaults. Mm-hmm. And one great solution was in the RTS Rise of Nations, where when you take your land units to the water, they literally just turn into boats. You know, they walk into the water, they magically become boats. You just cross the sea, and they turn into land units again. And I think I've heard Civ 5 is trying something similar to this.
Okay.
And I think generally that's a good solution if it works for your game.
Okay.
And I just want to pause 1 second to see if there's any questions from the VC. That. Thank you very much.
Thank you.